In this video, we are going to spend the entire video concentrating on a new kind of statement, the if statement. So far, we have only seen programs that have very straightforward control flows that just start at the top of main and just go statement, 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 all the way to the bottom. Right? And it is hard to write a program that does anything interesting at all if that's all that it does, if it just executes a sequence of instructions as though we're following the world's most straightforward recipe. The easiest way to explain how an if statement works is to just step through one. So let's take a look at one in Visual Studio. All right. I'm going to initialize this variable using datetime.now.hour. So recall that there is a static property on datetime that gives you the current time, and that there is an instance property on the datetime value that gives you the hour. Now this is something that we haven't seen before, chaining dotted expressions together like this. Right? So the way to think about this is this thing is a value, right? It produces the value that is the current date time, right? And this thing fetches a property from the thing that is to the left of the dot. And so we can just chain them together very nicely like this, right? So what's the hour? Well, the hour is 16. It's 4 p.m. here, right? And so we're going to say if the hour is less than 12, then write good morning. Otherwise, write good afternoon. Right? So when I step here, when I hit F10 to move to the next statement, right, it is not going to move down to this good morning. It's going to move down to this good afternoon. We'll see that here. Right? There it goes. Right? So we just skipped an entire statement here, and we skipped this else entirely as well, and stepped right down into this statement here. So this bit here is called the condition. So the if statement is if followed by a condition in parentheses. And then a statement, which is the consequence, then the word else, and then the statement, which is the alternative. And so the meaning is pretty straightforward. If the condition is true, the condition is Boolean, then the consequence is executed. If the condition is not met, then the alternative is executed. So we skipped the good morning. We went straight on to the good afternoon. Now, that's pretty neat, I suppose. You might ask yourself, well, what if we wanted more than one statement to be executed given a condition? Right? So let's take a look at this code right here. Well, we could say if the hour is less than 12, then write good morning, who wants breakfast? Otherwise, write good afternoon, who wants lunch? Okay, it seems like this is perfectly sensible consequence and alternative. But you notice we're getting a red squiggle here, right? And this is saying expected curly brace. All right, so this is one of those cases where C#, which usually does a very good job of the IDE telling you something's unexpected here, and here's what I think you should have. This really makes no sense at all here. What's happening is the consequence and the alternative of an if statement must be a single statement. Right? This is not a single statement. Right? So it sees the if. It sees a single statement. Right? The thing that follows it is another single statement. That's fine. And then instead of seeing this else, which now has no if associated with it, it expects that this should be the end of the main method. Right? This is kind of a bad error message. The C# team could frankly probably do better here. But coming up with these error messages is pretty hard. I know. I used to do it for a living. All right. So how are we going to solve this problem? Well, the thing here is this indentation is misleading. Right? These two statements are not actually both associated with this if. But we have a way to do that. We can introduce a block. So I'm going to put a curly brace around this thing. I'm going to put a curly brace around that. And now our error has disappeared. A block statement is a kind of statement, and it can be used anywhere that a statement is needed. And it consists of a curly brace called the open curly, another curly brace called the close curly, and as many statements as you want inside the block. And that number can be 0. There are some rare situations in which you want a block that does nothing. We're not going to run into too many of them in this course. There's kind of two ways to think about this. One way to think about this is with an if statement, you can either give the consequence a single statement or you can give it a block, right? That's not the best way to think about this. The best way to think about this is a block statement is itself a kind of statement, right? It is anywhere that you can use a single statement, you can use a block statement. It's a statement, right? So if you say an if has its consequence a single statement, a block is a single statement. So let's go back here. Now, what about this? We're not getting any error message down here for this, which looks equally bad, right? We've got an else. We know that the alternative that follows the else has to be a single statement. Well, it is a single statement, right? It's console.writeLine, good afternoon. This is, in fact, the next statement, right? I've got the indentation wrong here. And so this is another thing to keep in mind when you are reading C# code is, as I've mentioned before, white space is ignored by C#, right? You can have whatever white space you want. You can indent this as much or as little as you want, and it's the same program, right? And it is very easy to accidentally indent something to the same level as something else, and now it makes it look like these two statements are related when in fact they're not, right? So try to avoid that. This thing really should be in a block. What about if we nest an if statement? An if statement is a statement, as the name implies. So since the consequence and alternative of an if statement is a statement, we should be able to put an if statement inside an if statement, right? So let's say if the hour is less than 12, then we'll write good morning. Else, OK, now we need an alternative. What's the alternative? Well, our alternative is an if statement. We'll say if the hour is less than 18, then write good afternoon. Otherwise, if the hour is greater than 18, then we'll print good evening. Let's actually try this and see what happens. I'm going to delete this code here that we don't need anymore so that it doesn't confuse us. And we'll then just step into this code. All right, hour is 17. We've gone from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock since I've been recording this. And is hour less than 12? No, it's not. So we're going to skip the consequence, and we're going to step into the alternative. OK, what does the alternative do? The alternative says, is the hour less than 18? Well, the hour is 17. So yes, it is. So we take the consequence of this if statement, and we write out good afternoon. And if we look at our console window, in fact, we've written out good afternoon. All right, so we've seen that we can nest if statements, right? Because an if statement is just a statement, right? The consequence and the alternative can be statements. So it is traditional, because this is very common in C#, to have an if statement that is the consequence or the alternative of another if statement. These would get very deeply nested, and there would be a lot of indentation. So the traditional way to write this is like this, right? Because white space is irrelevant, as we've just learned, we can say if the hour is less than 12, then write this thing. Otherwise, if the hour is less than 18, then write this thing. Otherwise, write this thing, right? But remember, when you read it this way, this is, in fact, an entire separate statement, and that is the alternative that is associated with this if and this else. And we'll see an example where that can get quite confusing in a minute. All right, we can nest these things even deeper, right? We can say if the hour is less than 12, then write good morning. Otherwise, if the hour is less than 18, good afternoon. Otherwise, if the hour is less than 21, good evening. Otherwise, good night. And again, how this really is this whole thing is the alternative associated with this else, right? This whole thing is the alternative associated with this else. So we have if statements that are nested quite deep here, right? And if we debug into this thing, then we ask, is the hour less than 12? No, it's not. Is the hour less than 18? Yes, it is. Good afternoon. The rest of it we skip. All right. What if we want there to be no alternative? We might want to say, OK, well, if the hour is less than 12, then write good morning. Otherwise, write nothing. Well, we know that a block can be empty, right? So we could say else, and then we could just have an empty block. Do nothing. Well, what would happen then? Well, we step into the block. We enter the top of the block. We enter the bottom of the block. Doesn't do anything. We're done. Though that is legal, and people sometimes do that, it's actually not necessary. You can just delete this whole thing. It is legal for an if statement to have no alternative at all. Right? Now, another way to do this, and this is very rare, but it does happen sometimes by mistake, is to just put in a semicolon. And that looks kind of weird. And you'll notice, it's kind of hard to see here, but there's a green squiggly underline here. And if I mouse over it, it says possible mistaken empty statement. It turns out that in C#, it is legal to just have a semicolon, right? That is a statement which does nothing. It is a bizarre feature of C#. It is there mostly for historical reasons, backwards compatibility with previous languages that allowed this. It's bizarre and it's error prone, and that's why the language says, I think you probably didn't mean to do this. So don't do this. Just don't have an else at all, right? If you don't intend there to be a statement associated with the alternative of an if. Not a super common mistake, but it does occasionally happen that somebody will hit semicolon by mistake and not realize that they've just introduced a new empty statement. All right, so knowing that, here's a puzzle, right? I have if hour is less than 12, if hour is less than 6, right line, early bird, else, right line, sleeping in. All right, what's going on here? Well, the indentation has been removed by me, right? So it's hard to say what's actually going on here. There are a couple of possibilities. It could be that this whole thing is the consequence of this if statement, and this thing is the alternative of this if statement, right? Or it could be that this whole thing is the consequence of this if statement, and this if statement has no alternative. So which is it? Well, let's see what happens if we actually debug into this thing. All right, so we start off by saying if the hour is less than 12 and the hour is not less than 12, so we skipped the whole thing. We did not go to this else, right? So this else must be associated with this if, right? Otherwise, we would have stepped to it when this condition turned out to be false, right? So the correct formatting for this thing is like this. All right, so this if has no alternative. It has only a consequence. The consequence of this if is that. The consequence of this if is that. This problem, this kind of construct is historically been called the dangling else problem, because it's really not clear what this else is associated with. And I strongly recommend that you never write code that even looks like it might have the dangling else problem. It is much, much more clear to simply introduce an unnecessary block statement, right, that clearly indicates this whole thing is the consequence of this if statement, right? Just avoid the problem, period. All right. So far, all of the if statements that we've seen have been of the form something is less than something else, right? It turns out that an if statement can take any expression that evaluates to a Boolean, not just a comparison. So for example, we could store the comparison into this variable. We could say the variable is morning, right? It is equal to hour is less than 12, and it's false, right? And so now we could say if is morning is true. And this is terrible. Please do not do this. This is one thing more than anything else that where I can look at a piece of code and say, this was written by a beginner. Beginners get it into their head that every if has to have a comparison in it somewhere. But no, every if has to have a Boolean in it. And we already have a Boolean. We already know whether it's morning or not, right? This is essentially saying, if it is true that it is true that it is the morning, right? Instead of just if it's true that it's the morning, right? So don't do this, right? This is the far nicer way to do it, to just say if it's the morning, right? Now, you sometimes also see the same thing with false, right? If is morning is equal to false, right? This is also bad. It's not quite as bad as this thing with it being equal to, compared as equal to true. The better style thing to do is to use the not operator. If it is not true that it is the morning, then do this, right? These are exactly the same, right? This one compares the Boolean to false. This one inverts it and then checks to see if it's true. Logically, they're the same thing. It's just a stylistic thing. This is the preferred way to write it. So we can step through that. We'll see that it is, in fact, the afternoon. All right. You can also use and or in Boolean expressions that are in if statements, and this is very common, right? So let's fetch the day of the week. We learned in a previous video the day of the week is an enumerated type. It's actually an integer behind the scenes, but every one of the integers in it has a name, and we refer to them by their names. So it's a Thursday today. So then we'll ask, is it Saturday? Well, if the day is equal to day of the week dot Saturday, then it must be Saturday, right? It is not Saturday because it's Thursday. We could then ask, is it Sunday? Well, it's not Sunday because it's Thursday, right? We could then ask, if it's Saturday or it's Sunday, right? Then the consequence is, if it's the morning, then we'll say who wants brunch, right? Because we all want brunch on the weekend, right? Well, it is not Saturday or Sunday, right? We could also say, if it's Saturday or Sunday and it's the morning, then write who wants brunch. So this construct here, where we have a nested if, and this construct here, where we have two conditions that are related by an and, these are essentially the same construct. And which way you write it doesn't really matter. Some people prefer to write it the more verbose way, where the flow of control is a little bit more clear. Some people prefer to write it in this more concise way, where the level of nesting is a little bit less. Either way, perfectly acceptable. You'll see both. Summing up, an if statement takes a Boolean condition. It executes either the consequence or the alternative statement, but not both, depending on whether the Boolean condition is true or false. The else clause with its alternative statement is optional. You can omit it, but be careful when you do, because it's easy to get into the dangling else problem. You can always use block statements to combine any number of statements together. And I encourage you to use block statements with if constructs, particularly if they start to get complicated. It just makes the code easier to read. You can use the bang operator, that is the not operator, and the double ampersand and the double pipe to create conditions that check for logical inversion of a Boolean, or logical or of two Booleans, or logical and of two Booleans. And you should avoid direct comparisons to true or false, because they're almost always unnecessary.